Ata Maria, everyone. My name is Fiona Lavin from Wastemans, and welcome to this webinar this morning on Contaminated Sites and Vulnerable Landfills Fund with Ministry for the Environment. I'm just going to start us off this morning with a karakia before I introduce our speakers. Tutawa mai I runga, tutawa mai I raro, tutawa mai I roto, tutawa mai I waho. Kia tau au te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki tā katoa. Humie, huie, taikie. Well, as I said, welcome everyone. I hope this is the webinar that you thought you were attending this morning on Contaminated Sites and Vulnerable Landfills Fund. We're very happy to have Ministry for the Environment here to talk to us about this newly announced fund and some of the details for it. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions as we go, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. We will answer them all at the end of the webinar. So please feel free, though, if you think of something, just to pop it in there as you go. We do have everyone muted for this webinar, so that will be how we're rocking for this one, and we appreciate you joining us today. All right, just to kick things off, though, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So joining us, we have Carmel Mangan, who's the investment manager for Waste Investments. Carmel has worked in the Contaminated Land team at the Ministry for 5 years, developing contaminated land policy and administrating the Contaminated Sites Remediation Fund, which many of you remember as the CSRF. Carmel has recently joined the Waste Investment team to set up the new CSVLF. Carmel has a background in environmental chemistry and consulting, and in local government consenting, the NESCS, and is based in Wellington. So welcome, Carmel. We also are joined by Josh this morning. Josh Wilson is the Senior Investment Manager, Waste Investments. Josh has worked in the Waste Investments team at the Ministry for 3 years, working across waste minimisation funding and recently contaminated sites remediation funding. Josh has a background in working in local government and is based in Dunedin. And we also have joining an extra person today. Adrian Cook is currently the acting principal advisor for waste operations and has been with the ministry for over 2 years. She has previously worked in local government for over 11 years in the regulatory and policy space. A highlight from her local government career was the development of an award-winning significant site assessment framework for freedom camping bylaw development. She is a proud Scarfie, and during her years at Otago has obtained 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology and a Bachelor of Arts in Classics. She is from Te Aotearoa descent and currently resides in Taranaki. So welcome to all of our 3 speakers today. They will all be staying around as well to help with the Q&A at the end. So I do appreciate the time that you are committing to do this webinar today. So I'm going to pass you over to Carmel.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to our webinar for applicants to the Contaminated Sites and Vulnerable Landfill Fund, the CSVLF. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Wastemans and thank them for their support in hosting this presentation. The huge amount of mahi that's been done to bring you all here today. Engagement plays a significant role in achieving the best possible outcomes, and it's this type of collaboration and having these types of events that enable the ministry to reach out and connect. So again, a huge thank you to Wastemans. The webinar is being recorded, so you can check back in as well as check the website and the guide, but we're also keen for you to contact us if there are still any questions that you have after this presentation. In our presentation today, Josh and I will be covering the application process. There's a bit of background about the CSVLF and about eligibility. Then we'll be looking at certain parts of the application form itself and the type of information that you will need to include. We also have Adrian from our CME Waste Ops team here to talk to you about the new waste levy waiver and what it might mean for your project. We'll be finishing off with questions. We'll do our best to answer them all in the time that we have, but we'll also leave you with the CSVLF email so you can contact us afterwards with any questions you might have about submitting the application. Just noting as well that we're not going into detail around the panel process today, as there's another presentation on October the 25th. If you haven't already signed up for them, then please email us so we can add you to the list. So excuse me, the CSVLF replaces the CSRF. That's been funding the high-risk contaminated sites since 2006. So formerly, yes, the Contaminated Sites Remediation Fund. We now need to get our tongues around the Contaminated Sites and Vulnerable Landfill Fund. The CSRF was about supporting highly contaminated and complex sites that wouldn't get cleaned up without Crown funding. The purpose of the CSVLF is to continue providing this support with the inclusion of provisions for vulnerable sites. So this means that the focus has shifted from only targeting highly contaminated sites to also enabling funding for sites with low-level contamination, but that high risk of inundation and erosion. But it means that funding targets sites that have been identified as regional priority that stand to provide wider benefits from the use of public money. The CSVLF is being funded from the waste levy, and so funding has increased from 2.63 million annually. The current allocation from the waste levy is 30 million up to June 2026. The scope of the CSVLF is the same as the CSRF in that funding is only for phases 2 to 4, which are the investigation, remedial planning and remediation of contaminated sites as described in the Ministry's Contaminated Land Management Guidelines 1 and 5. Just noting that the key deliverables are to be done in accordance with Contaminated Land Guidance 1 and 5, and this includes that investigations and reporting are done by environmental consultants, known as Suitably Qualified and Experienced Practitioners, SQEPs. We also require that SQEPs have the relevant certification and that any reports are peer-reviewed by an independent SQEP. We don't fund phase 1. That's known as the preliminary site investigation, as this is typically part of the site identification stage where the history of hail and the contamination potential is established. Hail is, of course, the Ministry's hazardous activities and industries list. The initial identification is often done by regional councils who hold a contaminated site land use database and or by SQEPs reporting on the site's contamination history. If you're applying for phase 2 funding, then the PSI should be submitted when the application with the application form. Funding contaminated site remediation is one of the ways that the Ministry partners with local government and landowners to reduce the risk to communities and the environment. Regional, unitary and territorial councils all have contaminated land management functions under the RMA. So the aim of the partnership is to support those functions and to encourage and incentivise the clean-up of contaminated sites. Applying through regional councils has proven to be an appropriate and effective pathway for landowners to access public money and to get the scientific knowledge and expertise needed for contaminated sites projects. Regional councils are in a good position to determine if sites are eligible for funding, if they are a priority for the region, and if they have the resources to support the project. So they play a key role in as project partners, including often a source of co-funding, and the projects generally serve to strengthen the working relationship between the councils and other landowners. The CSVLF application pathway has been extended to enable territorial authorities to apply directly. This speaks to local councils being the predominant landowners of landfills, and it's giving them the opportunity to draw on their own resources to run these types of projects themselves, still in partnership with the regional councils to whatever extent the two parties consider necessary. Private landowners must still apply through the regional councils to ensure the proper use of public money for widespread public benefits. Funding is not available for private landowners, for example, where the remediation solely increases the value of private land and benefits to the individual. To be considered for funding, for CSVLF funding, an application must meet the eligibility criteria and the assessment criteria. So this includes that contaminated activities have occurred pre-1991, when the controls to manage and prevent contamination we have today were not in place. This is a time when land became contaminated, when hazardous substances were not used, stored, or disposed of in a safe way. In most cases, this means that the current landowner may not be accountable for the contamination, but they are willing to contribute to the cleanup. The contaminated activities occurred post-1991 when controls to prevent contamination came into play, but when no enforcement action for non-compliance activities could be taken. In some cases, the liability may not transfer to the current landowner, but they may be willing to contribute. The second part of this means that your application should also not relate to any works that have been ordered to be done under an abatement notice or an emergency response directive. To check if your site is eligible, so sites that are HAIL are likely to be on a regional council database. So we encourage landowners to discuss eligibility with regional councils, discuss their role as project partners, either in support of you running the project or if they are better suited to run the project when they have in-house scientific knowledge and that technical expertise needed for these types of projects. The assessment criteria include that priority funding will be given to highly contaminated and complex sites that pose a high risk to human health and the environment, and to contaminated sites or landfills that are vulnerable, where there is a high risk from climate-related erosion and inundation. Both types of sites are expected to have been identified as regional priorities that will benefit from financial assistance from the Crown, and both types of sites will be assessed on their ability to deliver and to provide those wider benefits from the use of public money. Including the principles of sustainable remediation management has been given more weight by being included in the CSVLF eligibility criteria to reflect our position on making decisions that will not compromise future generations. So remediation typically includes removing contamination, reducing contaminant concentrations, interrupting exposure pathways, or management of the site or activity. Sustainable remediation is an approach that considers the project more broadly in the contents of balancing the benefits. It's a practice that looks for opportunities to reduce the impact of the works as well as address the issues of contamination. So adopting a sustainable approach creates opportunities for innovative solutions that can achieve a reduction in the impact on natural resources, greenhouse gas emissions, and the generation or transfer of waste. The Contaminated Land Specialist, the SWEP, you engage for your project should be experienced in assessing sustainable remediation options and have a sound knowledge of the appropriate international standards that their assessment is expected to align with. Your application should not be for the total cost of the project. The ministry and the applicant each contribute 50% of the total project costs. Applicants are expected to secure the balance of the costs covered by their organisations or partners, and your application should confirm that you have sourced and secured your share, including how much is being made from contributions from other project partners. Any funding request for more than 50% of the total costs will be considered against the Waste Investments co-funding criteria, and it includes considering matters relating to equity, the project value, the size and scale of the project's benefits to Aotearoa New Zealand. The assessment criteria includes considering the co-funding principles, and the guidance for this is in line with other grant-orientated programs at the Ministry and relevant agencies. The project timeline relates to the time needed to achieve the project outcomes. Given the activities involved in a phase 2 investigation, for example, it's common for that to be done over the course of 12 months. And in some cases, it will include phase 3 remedial planning as well, depending on the complexity of the site. Likewise, given what's involved in a remedial works project, it's not uncommon for a phase 4 project to take 12 to 18 months, but it would be unusual for a project to take longer than 2 years. Your application should not include retrospective costs for works already done prior to the application being lodged, nor can they be claimed retrospectively if you are successful. Building on the eligibility criteria, the assessment criteria is based on several core principles, including partnership, priority funding, risk reduction, best practice, and investment impact. Partnerships are imperative to ensuring that costs, risks, and benefits are appropriately spread across the project partners, and in most cases, considering the roles and responsibilities of each party. Priority funding is about meeting the fund's aim to reduce the risk to human health and environment by cleaning up highly contaminated and vulnerable sites. Prioritisation is necessary wherever there is limited funding, even if it's 30 million in the pot. The project benefits and project delivery relate to the success of a project and return on investment. Assurances include that the same criteria and process is being applied consistently across all the applications. Your project will be assessed against the assessment criteria, so your application needs to provide sufficient detail that clearly demonstrates the need for and the value in seeking financial assistance. The risk needs to be appropriately identified, meaning that it's been investigated in a consistent manner and it's clear the issues need addressing. This includes the technical reports meet CLMG requirements, and that the project outcome includes determining and implementing the most plausible, cost-effective, and beneficial solution. The success of the project relies on having persons with the required skills, including technical, project management, and financial management skills, and for all the decision makers to be clear on the scale of the project and its relative objectives, the significance of the milestone activities, and that expenses are relative and reasonable. The Gazette notice and the guide for applicants provides detailed information on how the application will be assessed. So please do refer to those resources. That said, more on the level of information needed and the objectives and milestones will be covered later in the presentation. So check out the information provided on our website. Talk to your regional council and discuss the potential for partnering with them. Again, the guide and the application form have advice around the kind of information we need, but ultimately contact us if you do need help. We are here to support. So I'll now hand you over to Josh, who'll take you through filling in your application form and some key areas. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Carmel. So I'm going to go through into the weeds a little bit in terms of how to fill in the application form itself. So when you download the application form from the web page, you'll be opening up a Word document. The one thing to note about this is it's a locked document, which means there's only specific sections that are editable. So there'll be lots of areas that sort of locked in place, and then there'll be text boxes like the ones shown on screen here that you can add free text into. There'll be drop-down menus where you can select one of a few options, and then there'll be checkboxes as well in a couple of places where you can select multiple options. The majority of the guidance that we provide is in the application form itself, so definitely encourage you to read through the help text as you're going through the application. Hopefully that should support you in filling out the relevant sections. We have also put together a guide for applicants, which is also available on the web page. So it's just below, so where the application form link is, just below that, there's the guide for applicants. I'd encourage you to download this as well. It provides additional guidance on key sections and things like what costs are eligible, how your application will be assessed, and the like. But the main thing that we've tried to include in that guide for applicants is examples. So example text of key sections, things like the project summary, objectives, and milestone tables, which we'll go on to in the next couple of slides. So it's got examples that you can look at copy and use for your application, especially for phase 2 and 3 projects where a lot of the deliverables in terms of reports and things are fairly standardized. You're more than welcome to use the examples we've provided in that document and just refine them to be relevant to your project exactly. So the first so I'm going to go through a couple of sections, and one thing to keep in mind with the application form is that if you are successful in the process in getting funding, the application form will form the basis of the project plan and the funding agreement. So it all sort of builds on itself. So the first section that I'm going to cover off is the site information and site risk screening sections. So this is the most technical part of the application and pulls together the key information about the site history, any testing that's been done to date, and a summary of exposure modeling information. The information we request here is expected to have been collected during the site identification process and part of the preliminary site investigation. It's a really important part of the application because it provides the key details to assess the level of risk the site poses, including the level of contamination and vulnerability of the site. And depending on your level of knowledge and experience, you may need support to complete this section from a technical expert, or be drawing the information from technical reports that have been produced already on regarding the site. As Carmel mentioned before, we do request that any technical reports that you supply supporting documents such as the preliminary site investigation, and we encourage for you to get those reports peer reviewed by a independent, suitably qualified experienced practitioner, SQEP, to ensure that they're compliant with the relevant contaminated land management guidelines. So the next section I'm going to go over is the objectives. So these are statements that clearly describe what the project must do to be successful. So this is the core way we look at whether a project has delivered on what it intended to. So it's important that you make sure that they're relevant and realistic at the application stage. We do require all our objectives to follow the SMART framework. So that means that they're specific, it's clear and detailed, measurable, that you're easily able to demonstrate that the objective has been delivered, that achievable, that it's attainable, realistic, it can be reached within the resources available, and finally and importantly, timely. So there's a set time frame that the objective will be delivered within. So typically projects have between 1 and 4 objectives, and it really depends on the complexity. So an example, so for a phase 2 project, you might only have 1 objective relating to the detailed site investigation. A phase 3 may have 2, like the one shown, like the example shown on screen here, whereas a phase 4 might have a few more. And as I mentioned, we have examples in the guide for applicants, and I would encourage you to have a look, because for phase 2 and 3, you might be able to copy and paste directly and just amend slightly. Obviously, phase 4 might be slightly more project and site specific, but we do have some examples in the guide to give you an idea of what a good objective looks like, and sort of the level of detail you might want to go into at this stage. And the final thing on objectives, so on the next slide, I'm going to go into the milestone tables. And that's where you'll describe how you'll achieve each objective. So it's just a note that they are linked, and we'll ask for details on what activities and the budget required to meet each objective. So with that, I'll go on to the milestone table. So on screen at the moment is a example milestone table, and this is really the bones of how the project will be delivered. So each objective should have a corresponding milestone table that details how it will be met. So as you see on here, the top line and that sort of light bluish green color, that's all the sort of header milestone detail. So the milestone number, the objective that will be met, and then the start and due date of the milestone. With the start and due date, we ask for it to just be as realistic as you can be. Obviously, there's a few unknowns in terms of how long the application process will take, and we appreciate that things can get refined over time as planning is progressed. But one thing to try and do as much as practical is just make the interval between them, whether it's going to be 3 months to deliver that milestone, 4 months, whatever it is, between the dates. And then you've got the top line cost, so the total estimated cost on the far right, and then the ministry and co-funder contributions, so typically 50% each. And then we get into the activities and deliverables. So that's on the left-hand side, and that's darker blue. So an activity is the things that you'll do and you need to do to achieve the objective. So again, we've got some examples in the guide for applicants, but essentially they're the sort of building blocks to getting to the objective. So as you can see here, the objective is to complete an assessment of remedial options. So the first activity is likely to be to engage a consultant, a SQEP, to do that work, and then there'll be the process of delivering the report, having it peer reviewed, and then decisions being made on which is the preferred remedial option to go with. And then, as you can see at the bottom and in 9.6, there's the standard activity and deliverable, which is submitting ministry reporting documents. This will be included already when you download the application form, and it's just a standard one that we have in all of them. So just so you're aware that will be there. Against each activity, you'll also have a deliverable. So the corresponding deliverable is essentially evidence that you'll provide to demonstrate that the activity's been met. So like here, there's procurement process documentation, statement of works, that kind of thing in relation to the engagement of a SQEP, the delivery of the report itself, the technical reports, and if in terms of decision makers, that might be minutes from a meeting or written decisions from the elected council, the senior leadership team, or whoever the relevant decision maker is. So then, connected to each activity and deliverable, there's then the expenses. So that's in that pinkish color on the right hand side. So each we ask for all eligible expenses to be included here, and I'll go into which expenses are eligible and ineligible in the next slide. But essentially, it means that some of the activities may not have expenses attached to them. So as you can see here, we've just left them blank. So feel free to do that in your application forms, and just include the relevant and the eligible expenses. So the expense description is a free text box, so you can just briefly describe what the expense is. The expense type is a drop-down menu where you'll select from a few different options in terms of grouping the expenses, and then the expense estimate is obviously the total amount for that activity. And obviously we've just got some example numbers in there, and they're not realistic to the work described in the activities put forward. And the final thing that I'm just going to touch on in relation to the milestone table is, because the form that you'll download is locked, it essentially means that there's you can't add and remove tables, and you can't add and remove rows from the tables. So in the form, there'll be 4 milestone tables. Each will have the 6 rows as shown here. But essentially, all I want to say is that don't feel like you have to fill them because they're there. Just leave any tables that you don't need blank, and any rows that you don't need blank as well. If the application is successful, then we'll be able to tidy that up at the next phase. But it's just a function of it being of a locked form. We think this will be more than enough for the vast majority of applications. But if you are hitting a brick wall and you feel like you don't have enough space to put everything in, then just send us an email, and we can work through that with you on our email address that we'll share. So I'm going to talk briefly about the budget, the key guidance for this is in the guide for applicants. So there's a table in there that I'd encourage you to take a look at, which shows the eligible costs and some examples of ineligible costs. So essentially, with the eligible costs, it's really what we're expecting to see is the investigation work, drafting reports, peer reviews of those reports, and any direct costs of undertaking the remedial works. So that might be doing the assessment of remedial options report, the remedial action plan, and the like, actually doing the remedial works and any site validation after the fact as well. The examples of ineligible costs are things like in-kind costs, so that's staff time, donated equipment, and the like. Retrospective costs in most cases, so this is costs that have been incurred before the deed of funding has been signed. Purchase of capital assets, and also site improvement costs, like amenity facilities, playing fields, car parks, that kind of thing that might be put on the site after the remediation has been completed. But yeah, as I say, there's more detail in the guide for applicants, and if you have any questions, then do come through to us. So once you've finished your application and you're ready to submit it, you'll send it through to us with any supporting documentations at the email address, and then eligible applications will be assessed against the assessment criteria by the panel, and they'll provide recommendations to the ministry. So the things that they could recommend include whether the project should be funded, the level of funding, and also if they've identified risks, they may recommend putting conditions on the funding offer to manage those risks. The final funding decisions will be made either by the relevant person at the ministry if you're requesting under $1 million, but if you're requesting more, then it will go through to the Minister for the Environment to make the final funding decision. And as Carmel mentioned, in terms of the panel, there'll be an email going out this afternoon with some more details. If you don't receive that email and you would like to, then send us an email and we'll add you to the list and provide the information. But there should be more information coming out shortly in relation to the being on the panel and the panel process. So final slide from me. So I just wanted to share this graphic. It's on our website and in the guide as well. And it just gives a really high-level overview of what to expect from the process, both the application and then the following processes from there, and timeframes. So I just think it's a useful sort of snapshot of what to expect when you're looking at applying to the fund. So with that, I'll pass on to my colleague Adrian, who's going to talk to waste levy waiver provisions. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Josh. Today I'll go through the new waste levy waiver provisions under the Waste Minimisation Act. The waste levy waiver is an additional option that you may want to consider, as well as the CSVL funding. Or if you weren't successful with the CSVL funding, you may want to consider an application for a levy waiver as part of your project. Just to give you a bit of a background on the waste levy, just in basic terms in relation to the waiver, so very narrow scope. Every time waste is taken to a levy liable disposal facility, that waste is charged a gate fee. And from that gate fee, there is a charge that covers operators' costs. And there is also a portion that is the levy waiver itself. The levy itself. A different rate of levy is charged depending on the class of that disposal facility. A disposal facility operator basically collects that levy and then they pay it to the ministry, unless a waiver or an exemption exists. Historically, we've only had one mechanism for a waiver of the levy, which was exceptional circumstances, and that was actually quite a high threshold to meet. So as from July 1 this year, we've had additional mechanism, which is to waive the levy for the remediation of contaminated sites. It's important to note that we can only assess remediation projects where waste has been disposed of from 1 July 24 onwards. So how does this process work? An application for levy waiver will need information from both your disposal facility operator, your DFO, and yourself as the site remediator or waste generator. What we suggest is that information is shared between those two parties to basically form a joint application. For example, councils have existing contracts, or sometimes in some instances, they're both the DFO and the remediator. And information shared between those entities could be a bit more easier. Others may have to consider how information is shared between two parties. In most instances, but not all, it would be quite hard for a DFO alone to provide the information required for the levy waiver, as they won't know the ins and outs of your particular remediation project. Because a DFO is required to collect and pay the levy, they will need to be the one who lodges that. And they apply through the online waste levy system, and it's OWLS for short. If you've provided information as part of your CSVL project, or it's still in progress, or you've been approved, that information can be provided as part of the process and can contribute towards that levy waiver application. And if you haven't been successful in a CSVL funding and it's been declined, that information can still be used as part of the levy waiver application. Really important to note that a decline from the CSVL funding does not preclude you from applying for a levy waiver and the remediation of your contaminated site. Other aspects you might want to consider is if once you're actually taking the waste and you're screening and sorting it and trying to minimize, you might be taking it to various different classes of landfill. And in those cases, if it's levy liable and you want to get a levy waiver, they will need to apply. So each facility would need to do that. We want to make multiple facility applications easy and enable that information sharing on the project to happen as much as possible. Each DFO will need to lodge online, but we would suggest that either yourself as remediator or whoever's taking the lead, project lead, contact us to advise us if there's going to be those multiple facilities taking waste from your project. When it comes to the waiver application, information about the story of the project is going to be really important to support the application. You'll need to provide evidence to meet that test of reasonableness. This can be found in the purpose of the Act, which is to protect the environment from harm, provide environmental, social, economic, and cultural benefits. If you've got any questions about the levy waiver process, please contact us on the email shown on screen at levyadmin@mfe.govt.nz. Just to reassure you, further guidance on the new waiver provisions will be released soon. So I'll now hand back to Carmel. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. So just closing with on the waste levy advice that Adrian has given you, we do encourage you to always include the waste levy in your budget for disposal of material. In the space provided in the application form, let us know whether you intend to work with your DFO on a waste levy waiver, and if your application is successful, we'll work with you on this during the contracting process, including amending the budget if it's required. So we will work with you on this, and we will also work with you with Adrian as well on this. So thank you. That brings us to the end of our presentation, and we would like to, excuse me, open this up to questions, which our colleague, the lovely Ella Van Gaal, is helping us with as well.
Kia ora. Thank you, team. That was very informative. We have a couple of questions. So for those of you who have additional questions, please put them in the Q&A section. But we'll start off with a warmer-upper for you, Carmel, from Dave. Did I hear correctly? You require SQEPs to have certification. What precisely is sought?
Thank you, Dave. That's a really good question. So we are aligning our requirements with the advice and the guidance in the NESCS. So if you do need further information around what certification looks like, then that's a good source of information for you. And also too, the fact that with these types of projects, we are looking for the subject expertise and that level of expertise that is required for these types of high-risk projects. So that's where we align ourselves with the idea of certification.
Thank you. And then I think I have one for you, Josh, also from Dave. Do you have any guidance on allowing for unexpected discoveries, uncertainties in times and volumes and so on? What kind of contingency provision might be considered acceptable?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so we definitely appreciate that with these types of projects that there can be unforeseen costs involved, and encourage you to include reasonable contingency, especially at the remediation stage. We don't provide obviously every site's slightly different. Our main test is reasonableness in this space, and just making sure that there's sort of adequate money to finish the job. The one thing I would note is that when you apply for funding, it's typically we can only fund up to the amount approved, and only in exceptional circumstances does that ever go beyond that during the life of the project. So we do encourage you to make sure that you're making those considerations during the application stage in terms of what contingency may be needed and what's reasonable in the circumstances, in terms of the what's known about the site and the potential for unexpected discoveries during the remediation process.
Thank you, Josh. I have one for you, Adrian. Thinking particularly of the case where landfill material is moved to another landfill, is that a valid argument for levy waiver? I mean, it's already waste.
This is a very good question. What we would need to know is, why were you moving that waste? And there'll be a wide range of reasons. Some, for example, could be inundation of a site, so it's now sort of breaching and going along sort of a river or something like that. So there would be reasons as to why you'd be moving that waste, and that's really the story we need to know and understand, and how that relates back to the purpose.
Thank you. I think this one is for you, Carmel. Would a council-operated landfill on private land that has not modern environmental measures, i.e. no liner, gas capture, leachate controls, qualify for this fund?
Thanks, Ella. Yes, so when we're talking about private landowners, we are focusing on the idea that these, as I mentioned, that the benefits are realised by the wider persons, so, and the community and the environment. So the idea that where the landfill is on private land, that wouldn't exclude it from being able to apply. But this is where the conversation comes in with the regional council to understand the full scope of what's been achieved through the funding, and also to who benefits from the funding. And ultimately it is to reduce the risk. So that's where those conversations with the regional council will actually, and the landowner, and if the landowner operator, although it is expected that it's no longer operating, but those conversations will be able to flesh out whether or not the project is one that is eligible.
Thank you. Josh, I have two I'm going to ask you at the same time. Assuming that the application meets the definition of reasonable, is there a cap to the available funding per project? And then would you advise applying one stage at a time, i.e. apply for DSI this round, wait for next round to apply for ORA stage, or apply for both stages at one?
Yeah, thanks, Ella. So in terms of a cap on funding, so there's no official maximum amount of funding that can be provided through the fund. Obviously, there's limited funding available, and we have to make sure we're using the money we have to have the most impact we can. Yeah, I think obviously if I would definitely encourage you to reach out to us, especially if it's a really significant project. Come and have a chat to us, and we can talk through that. But yeah, there's no upper limit of the amount of funding available, apart from the details on the funds available for the whole CSVLF. In terms of putting two types of or two stages together, or two phases of project, this is definitely something you can do. I think what we just encourage is that just make it practical. 2s and 3s, so the detailed site investigation and then remedial planning, can tend to come together, but then typically phase 4, you need the details of the remedial planning work to inform the application to a phase 4. But yeah, you can definitely apply for multi-phase projects, but just consider what's reasonable, and what makes sense in your situation.
Thank you. Adrian, what is the likely turnaround time for a waste levy waiver approval?
That would very much depend on the information that's provided. So a more comprehensive application would probably be a quicker turnaround. If we are needing to go backwards and forwards to the applicants to get more information, that will probably delay things a little bit. We also would work very closely with disposal facility operators around invoices that are coming up that are due. So if that waste has already gone through their system.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question on the landfill on private land one. Does it disqualify the landfill if it is currently operating and under a local council?
Thanks, Ella. So you'll see in the eligibility criteria that it has ceased operating. The idea is that if it is still operating, of course, there is still the opportunity for there to be controls in place and after a management plan and the likes that will be preventing contamination. So the idea is that we are looking at, as we were with the CSRF, we are looking at legacy contamination and cleaning up sites that there is no ability to actually enforce any kind of cleanup on the site.
Thank you. Next question. I assume that protecting the environment from harm includes people, so removal of landfills that mitigate for climate change exacerbated flooding upstream would potentially qualify. I think it's for you, Carmel.
I can pick that one up. Yeah, so I think
yes.
Yeah, I mean, protecting the environment from harm is and human health is definitely part of the assessment criteria and the purpose of the fund. I'm not sure I'm fully following the exact details of the site specifically, but yeah, the key things is that we're prioritizing funding towards sites that pose the highest risk to human health and the environment.
Thank you. And I think we're going back to you, Adrian. How would remediation contamination be defined as part of the landfill levy waiver? Would it be targeted towards sites which pose a risk to human environmental health, or include sites which are above background but below SCS? And how would sustainable remediation considerations be included?
So it is very much a case-by-case basis, and we are looking at, again, the purpose of the Act. So it will be, you know, all sorts of factors that can come into it, such as you've mentioned there around climate change, and also sort of inundation, but also looking at sites that have caused concern for communities, I suppose, as well. Have that as a consideration in the back of your mind, that there are particular sites that you know that communities are really chomping at the bit to get sorted. You might want to look at those types of things as well.
Thank you. And Joe made it into the Q&A. Earlier this year was discussion of an assessment tool for categorizing sites. Is this still in development and tied into fund criteria in any form?
So this would be the Vulnerable Landfills Risk Assessment tool that is going through its stages, and just confirming that it's not linked directly to anything to do with the fund, but we do understand that obviously this is going to put landowners and councils in a better position to understand the risks of the landfills within their regions, and inevitably to be able to assist them and prioritise which ones do need to be addressed. And if that also means coming through the fund, well, then that's an option as well. But there is no direct link between that tool and this fund.
Thank you. And then we have next question. Focus on sustainable remediation and management was mentioned. This often requires consideration or broader environmental outcomes and may need ecological, cultural, coastal adaptation assessments, etc. Are these kind of assessments eligible for funding as part of phase 3?
Typically, as part of phase 3, when the sustainable remediation is part of those conversations around what options are available and the benefits, and how more broadly you can reach those benefits and who will benefit from them, of course. So big on the benefits. These are the conversations that you'd be having with the contaminated land specialist and with the SQEP, and it's expected that those, considering all those options, is actually part of the planning phase. Sustainable remediation has been a part of the funding consideration. It's just that it's been pulled through into the eligibility criteria. So you'll see in guidelines 1 and 5 that sustainable remediation is referred to. So again, it's also lining it with the practice of contaminated land management practice anyway. So getting that advice from the SQEP in terms of to what extent that assessment involves, what it's definitely part of that phase 3.
Thank you. And then we'll go to our last question before Fiona closes us out. Can the construction of a stop bank, with the key outcome being to proactively avoid a vulnerable landfill being eroded by a river, be funded or part funded by this scheme?
So we are focusing on reducing the risk from contamination and the risk of waste discharging from the landfill, and we are making a clear distinction between any structures that actually do just hold back the situation. Again, this will be something that's considered during the options analysis. The SQEP will be feeding into those conversations and also into those options and how viable they are. And if there is a structure that can do both, there is the potential that that could well be eligible for funding. But it's very much drawing that line between something that is a protective measure versus something that is actually designed and has a function to reduce the risk and to remove exposure pathways.
Thank you. I think that is it for the questions. I'm posting an email address here in case you think of anything else. just want to reiterate, you should be receiving a electronic direct mailer from the ministry right after this to sign up for the panel webinar. If you don't get it, please let us know if you want to get those kind of notifications, and we'll add you to the list. And with that, I'll hand back to Fiona. Thank you.
Kia ora, thanks, Ella. Thank you all very much from MFE for coming along today and giving the really comprehensive overview, I think, of the fund. Hopefully they've been able to answer everyone's questions. I see that there's nothing left in the Q&A, so that's brilliant. So I'm just going to close this out with a karakia today. Kia whakaera te tapu, kia wata ai te ara. Kia turiki whakataha ai, kia turiki whakataha ai. Humie, huie, taikie. Thank you all for coming along today.